I just wanted to welcome and thank everyone for joining us at this session, Developing Students' Reflection Skills Through Assessment and Feedback Strategies. I'm Katherine Lithgow. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the Senior Educational Developer, Integrative and Experiential Learning with the Center for Teaching Excellence. And with me is Victoria Feth.
Hi, everyone. I'm Victoria, and I am the Faculty Liaison to Arts, as well as the affiliated and federated institutions of Waterloo.
So just a few housekeeping items before we begin. This webinar will be recorded and it's going to be shared on the CTE website and YouTube channel. There will be a question and answer part that will be recorded, but it's for our references only. It won't be shared online. We invite you to turn on your video if you wish. If not, you can turn it off. If you're not speaking, we just ask that you please mute your microphone just to cut down on the background noises. And feel free to ask questions either by raising your hand and asking them, or you can just plop it into the chat. So this webinar is the third in a series of webinars that we've offered in the past few months to address the interest that we've seen in incorporating reflection into courses and programs. So on your handout sheet, there's a link to the previous session recordings, which we'll also include in our follow-up email after this session. And for today's session, what we're going to do is begin with a brief introduction to reflection, just to make sure everyone is on the same page. Then we'll review briefly the frameworks that we had introduced in a previous session, and then we're going to move into the focus of our session. How can we use assessment and feedback strategies to help students develop their reflection skills? So we hope that this session will help you identify strategies and activities that you can use in your own courses and programs. But more important, we hope that you can use this webinar to help you view feedback as something more than just providing information to students, and instead view feedback as something that students are able to act upon in a timely manner and incorporate that feedback into subsequent reflection activities to get some more feedback and to see how they are improving over time within your course and over the duration of their time with us here at the university. Now, I'm sure many of you have seen this quote by John Dewey. We don't learn from reflection, we learn by reflecting on it. So what I'd like to do is just take maybe 30 seconds, 45 seconds, and just quickly jot into the chat some of the words or phrases that you might include in a definition. So we'll just be looking at the chat to see what comes up here. And thanks for putting the handout sheet in the comment area, Victoria. And when you see me looking off to the side, I have two screens here, so I'm just checking the chats. We've got thinking. What are some other words that come to mind? Critical, yeah, thanks. Higher, deeper learning, thanks, Trish. Yeah, these are all good. Interpret, Louis, yeah. Great. Okay, well, thank you very much for participating. Growth, yeah. In that. So let's take a look at what some folks from the University of Edinburgh have included when they talk about critical reflection. We're going to be introducing you to one of the toolkits that they have made throughout this webinar. But when they talk about critical reflection, some of the things that they focus on are it being an examination of our experiences, our thoughts, our actions, to help us learn about ourselves, to make sense of situations that inform future action. There's always that component of, the thinking and the doing, or, doing some kind of action after we've reflected on it, and examining the past to inform the actions that we're going to take in the future. Now, Dewey had quite a few things to say about reflection, and what we are going to do is just emphasize a couple of them. So first of all, it's a learned skill that has to be practiced, and it's informed by feedback. It's a meaning-making process. It has an emotional component to it, and it takes time to do well. And I'm just going to say that last part again. It does take time to do well. But it's time well spent, because when it's done well, reflection can help us improve our own practice and gain better outcomes in the future. It can help us improve our performance and our skills. It can help us identify and articulate our abilities, our skills, and document them with evidence. It helps us evaluate the quality and the success of our plans for actions. We can use it to develop our employability skills, and it can help us connect theory to practice and enhance our understanding of underlying theories. So if you were looking at this list, there may be some benefits that resonate with you more when you're thinking about your own course. So with that in mind, I'm going to pass it over to Victoria to talk about reflective frameworks. So I'm going to give you control.
All right, thank you, Katherine. All right, so Katherine has just reminded us what reflection is and why you might want to include it in your courses. And you're here, so you're probably convinced that reflection is worthwhile. So what is that first step toward assessing reflection? Well, you can begin by choosing an appropriate reflective framework. So the appropriate framework should match your purpose for asking your students to reflect. In other words, choose a framework that aligns with your learning outcomes. The planning questions on the next slide can help you to ensure that you're keeping your purpose front and center in your early decision-making process. And those planning questions also appear on your handout if you're referencing it. And remember that incorporating opportunities to reflect into your courses should be part of your design process and not an afterthought. So these questions come from the Excellent Reflection Toolkit from the University of Edinburgh. And we'll reference this toolkit and these questions throughout this webinar. These questions, in particular the bolded ones, can help you think about what reflective framework you should choose for your course. So for example, I often see reflection tagged onto an assessment strategy as a high-stakes summative assessment of 30% or more. And the intention is pure. You want to move away from high-stakes tests, exams, and other traditional forms of assessment. But if the purpose for reflection isn't represented in your learning outcomes, and therefore opportunities to practice reflection are not woven throughout the course, then it's unlikely that students will learn much from their reflective practice. So in the following slides, we'll share some frameworks that will probably be familiar to you, especially if you've attended our previous webinars in this series, but we're not going to linger on them long. We'll just suggest at a high level the purpose of each framework so you can mentally check if any of them would be a good starting place for you. And again, if you're following along on your handout, those frameworks are there with a short statement describing their purpose. So the what, so what, now what is a relatively simple framework, very suitable for novice reflectors. It's based on the need for practitioners to operate in the real world of practice, the need to identify, make sense of, and respond to real life situations. And we'll show a link to a rubric later on that really aligns well with this and clarifies that connection to practice, in this case, nursing. So DEAL, which stands for Describe, Examine, and Articulate Learning, is helpful for reflections on personal growth, community service learning, professional development, and academic enhancement. And it's a well-rounded and adaptable framework because it can be used to cover one or each of those. Gibbs framework acknowledges that personal feelings, or the affective domain, influence the situation and how you have begun to reflect on it. So that's why we like to include it here, so that we're not forgetting the role of feelings in our reflection. So Bain's 5 R's is a framework for reflecting on professional practice, once again, but specifically substantive experiences. So it's about more than recalling the events of the day. It involves the conscious examination of experience and requires a concerted attempt to make professional sense of what has been learned. And finally, in our overview of frameworks, is STAR, which stands for Situation, Task, Action, and Result, and might also include or conclude with L for Learning or T for Transfer. This framework helps you to document evidence of learning and professional capabilities to draw upon for job interviews. And of course, PebblePad, our ePortfolio and learning journey platform, has several pre-existing templates that you can direct your students toward to have them fill out. And with that overview of frameworks and how you might choose one, I'm going to flip this back to Katherine, who's going to look at actually choosing to assess the reflections that students produce with those.
Wonderful. Thank you, Victoria. Okay, so for this, the next little while, what we're going to do is assume that you found a framework that works nicely for you, and your next step is going to be deciding whether you are going to assess the reflections. And we're going to look at a few questions or things to consider to help you to make that decision. So we've already looked at how will you steer and influence the type of reflections your students produce. Part of that can be accomplished by choosing the appropriate framework and the slides. On the previous slides, what I'd like to do now is just focus a little bit on the first two questions. So how will you indicate to students the importance of reflection within your course? And how will you encourage the students to engage appropriately with reflection? So students are likely to review a reflective task as more important, and they're more likely to engage meaningfully with it if there are marks associated with it. That's just, how they've been trained, and that's how they determine value of something in a course. They look at the marks. Now, if the reflection is to be completed outside of the class time, then the marks signal that it's worthwhile, and even to the extent how worthwhile. If you decide to do a reflective activity in class, then sometimes just providing the class time signals that this is something that you've determined is important, and that in itself gives the activity value. So if you decide to formally assess reflection, you are going to have to provide your students with clear definitions of both the assessment criteria and the marks that are associated with that criteria, so that they know what you are expecting. And if you choose not to formally assess reflection, you might decide that maybe you don't need to provide so much structure and guidance, but you do run the risk of students producing very superficial reflections if they don't have that structure and guidance. If you decide to run the activities during class time and then not assess it, that's fine. But you will want to make sure that your students recognize the value that they will get by participating fully in the activity. So they have to see the value and they have to know what's in it for them. Now, regardless of whether you assess or not, to show the students this importance of reflection and to encourage them to engage deeply, you'll want to clearly communicate the benefits of reflection. Students don't want to spend time on things that they don't find relevant. So things that you can do in that regard is explain what the rationale for the activity or the assignment is. So being very transparent and very explicit. Explain what you expect from it, and be very clear about the value that the students should get from completing it. So let's look at a couple of assessment types and what some of the associated, benefits or criteria are with them. So if you decide to make your reflective activity voluntary, then the task is not assessed, and the student, if they complete it, it's not going to affect their grade. So unfortunately, it's likely only the very intrinsically motivated students are going to take the time to complete this and do it seriously. If you decide to say that the grades are for completion, again, the only criteria for assessment is whether they have completed it or not. So again, the quality is not judged, and many students will do the bare minimum. Okay, so you may not get very much quality, even though they have gone through the motions of completing the reflection. So assessing then helps you sort of steer the type and the quality of the reflection that students produce. They're going to write for you as the audience, and they're going to deliver according to the criteria and the expectations that you set for them. So remember that being asked to reflect is something that's probably very new to them. So they're going to need guidance, they're going to need structure, they'll want to know the rationale, why they should even be doing this, and they're going to need this in order to motivate them to engage in it. So with that in mind, we can do a formative assessment, which is a kind of assessment that is intended to support student learning. So typically, or I guess in the purest form, grades usually aren't applied, but often what we find in practice is that low stakes grades are required just to motivate the students to complete it. But again, the purpose of this is to provide feedback to the students about their performance and help them improve as they move forward. In contrast, the summative assessment is intended to evaluate that student learning by comparing it with a set of criteria. The performance on the assessment is going to affect their grade. And while we encourage you to give them feedback, usually with a summative assessment, there is not an opportunity for the student to actually do anything with that feedback. So in this regard, if you are going to give summative assessment and it's going to impact their grade, then students should have been exposed to multiple times and opportunities throughout the course to practice this so they can prepare for that summative evaluation. So another thing that we can look at to determine whether we're going to assess or not is look at some of the pros and cons of who is going to be assessing it. And for this, I'd like to introduce you to the Edinburgh Reflection Toolkit. And I'd like you to go to the link that's listed here. It ends with Assess Assignment. And we're going to take a few minutes to just on your own, you're just going to scroll through, and I just want you to take a look at the summative assessment performed by section and the formative assessment performed by. And on that page, you'll see there's pros and cons of for each type of marker. So what are the pros and cons of having the instructor do the marking? What are the pros and cons of having peers? And what are the pros and cons of having yourself do it? And as you're going through this, you might be thinking about how this might inform your choice of whether to assess reflection. So I'll just pop that in the chat just in case people don't have the.
I got it in there, Katherine.
Oh, you have it in there? Thanks, Victoria.
No problem.
Okay, so we'll just take about 3 minutes to just give you time to look through that. And then this is your first introduction to this Edinburgh Reflection Toolkit. So does anyone have any thoughts on how these questions or these components might influence the decision you make as to whether to assess or not? Does anyone have any thoughts they want to share on that? Is there anything that surprised you? Anything that sort of resonated with you, concerned you? You just see Cheryl and Tricia typing something here. I feel students might be uncomfortable with depending upon who is assessing. Is that what you were thinking, Cheryl? Yeah, Tricia's saying you'd probably need to assign marks to the peer review option to motivate them to engage with that process. We have a couple of examples that we'll be talking about for peer review. And
no, I saw Jennifer.
I'm going to pass it over to you, Victoria.
Sure, I did see Jennifer had her hand up briefly. I don't know if that was a on purpose hand or a accidental hand. But,
my mic is pretty bad, but I was gonna say something similar to what Cheryl said, that when the students like the sharing and the comfort of sharing and putting themselves out there, and whether they like if they're what they're saying they're not confident in it in what they're saying, or if like is that pressure that we should be putting on students, like to encourage them to share their ideas?
I think part of that would go, well, first one would be the topic of what it is that you're having them reflect on. Definitely that would something you'd want to take in to account. The other thing that you can do is help them see the value in recognizing that their peers are a good source of feedback. And we've got a few things that we can do to address that, but you're correct. There are going to be some students who will feel uncomfortable with it. And again, having that value shown to them, I think, will help overcome it. Shall we move on, Victoria? We'll just...
Yep, we can move on. I was just going to add too that there's the time aspect to consider. So always needing to take time to kind of train students to do that peer or self-review to make them comfortable with it. So it's difficult to escape that there is a time investment involved in this, although we do try to give you a few corners to cut toward the end. So let's go on. Am I showing the providing feedback slide, Katherine? Going to assume yes.
I can't move my screen here anymore.
Yeah,
right. You are, Victoria.
Yes.
Okay,
there you are,
you.
Victoria. Okay.
Thanks. All right, so we've talked about choosing an appropriate framework for reflection, followed by choosing whether to assess reflection. And now we're going to move into the nuts and bolts of this webinar, and that is providing feedback and sometimes numeric grades for reflection. So let's continue some of this conversation that's already started about assessment, feedback, and you. Take a minute or so to answer any of the questions that pop out to you from this slide in the chat. So the first three are sort of thinking about assessment practices generally, and the last one is about porting those over to assessing reflection. Time consuming. Yes. So is that one of the things that brought you here today, Trish, hoping to find some of those secret corners that you can cut while still offering a good experience for students? Among other things. Great. Well, hopefully we'll get to some of those other things too. And Steve shared thinking of trying on-the-go reflection on a daily basis, followed by an end-of-week reflection that might be a summary. That sounds interesting. We'll have to hear more about that if we have some time at the end for our Q&A. And I'll just wait for one more. One or two more. And just looking, thinking about what Trish has said, among other things, yes, if we don't cover something that you came here hoping to learn, we do have a solid amount of time set aside at the end to talk. So definitely be sure to bring that up, and Katherine and I will do our best to cover that too. So Cheryl says marking takes a long time if you're giving valuable feedback. Yes, we do have some strategies for that, so that's great. And Jennifer says it's a challenge if activity is done verbally in a lecture. So yes, getting those quiet students to participate. That's a great question, and maybe we can come back to that one at the end too. I don't think that we've sort of talked about that angle of things at all. Alrighty. So considering your answers to the previous questions, let's take a look at this recent quote from Bode and Dawson. Feedback is no longer seen simply as comments provided by teachers to students about their work, but as a process that needs active and continuing student engagement if it is to lead to learning. So does this impact your thoughts on assessment and feedback? And if so, how? You're invited to share again. I could take a stab just looking at the concern that's come up already and that we often hear around the time investment. And within this quote, I think that it would lead one to think that there would be a healthy amount of time investment if you're engaging the student to this degree. But if you do break into Boud's literature, it's more about training the student so that it takes less time for you because they do become better and better at doing it for themselves. Thanks for sharing that, Marco. Yeah, we'll try to come back to that too toward the end. All right, let's go on then and look at this continuation of the quote. So Bode and Dawson go on to reference Carless, who describes feedback as an ongoing process in which all parties have a role to play. So if we consider our previous slides about who is assessing, those traditional voices like instructors and TAs continue to play a role in providing feedback, but now students are intentionally invited into the conversation. So they need to know that only through their own actions can feedback lead to useful outcomes. All right, so this philosophy here is the backbone of assessment, grading, and feedback practices outlined here. You must give a grade, but the way you do so and how you give feedback and invite students into the conversation can actually free some of your time and concerns about giving the right grade. So moreover, models and exemplars which show students what does and doesn't work help students to do better in the first place through better understanding of their own grades and feedback. And then if they are doing better in the first place and struggling less, then often that will lead to you having less need to have your own input. So at this point in your learning design process, you've probably come to one of two conclusions, to either move ahead with a pre-existing framework like those we briefly touched on earlier and a corresponding rubric, or to create some or all of the structure, including the framework and marking scheme yourself. Remember to return to the planning questions often to ensure you're keeping your purpose for reflection front and center. So here are those planning questions again, with the ones focused on assessment bolded for you. And now ideally, if you applied these questions to the process of choosing your reflective framework, you're already more than halfway to building your criteria set just based on what is included in your framework. We'll unpack that a little bit. But first, let's, before we look at specific rubrics that connect to these frameworks, let's review some considerations for the use and creation of rubrics in general. So a good rubric will limit the amount of work you need to do, in other words, the amount of descriptive feedback you need to provide, by showing students what they missed and how to achieve it next time. But of course, I'm sure you all know that finding that good rubric is a balancing act between the criteria specificity and how general it is, how long it takes you to use, or how user-friendly it is. But there are many general benefits of using a rubric, extending beyond reflection. So for instructors and TAs, a rubric can help ensure consistency in the grades given, reduce time spent grading, and importantly, identify clear strengths and weaknesses in work and therefore make feedback easier, which also helps students identify clear strengths and weaknesses and therefore make feedback useful. So often you can find a rubric that corresponds directly to your chosen framework, and then you can sort of personalize it with some minor tweaks. We encourage you to Google away until you find something that works for you, but we also offer these prepared rubrics that correspond directly to the frameworks we shared earlier. And this is linked for you on your handout as well, if you're following along there. So each of these rubrics is a little different in style, so we hope you'll look at each one. But for example, the University of Alberta's What, So What, Now What rubric really highlights how that framework aligns with professional practice. So that's just a reminder that making sure that you're checking in with your learning outcomes at each stage of this process will keep everything aligned and purposeful. So now I'm going to turn briefly to Katherine to share the WAT-CV rubric and how it corresponds to the STAR-L reflective framework while making feedback and grades clear and useful to students. Katherine?
Great. Thank you, Victoria. And I'm going to share my screen. I think this is the one I want here. Okay, can everyone see the WAT-CV rubric here? It says University of Waterloo at the top, WAT-CV.
Yep.
Yep, great. Okay, so this is a custom-built rubric that we used or we created for this WAT-CV, which is basically helping students identify and articulate skills that they are developing in the courses, and help them to articulate that to another person, which is the employer. So it was custom built, but there are a number of features within it that you might want to incorporate into your own rubrics or your feedback statements. You're welcome to use any of the wording or the phrasing that you find on this. And if you decide that you'd like to investigate the WAT-CV assignment in more depth, you're welcome to get in touch with me and you can use this rubric. But one of the things we wanted, or a few of the things we were looking at when we created the rubric, was we wanted to be able to scaffold student learning with formative feedback, and we wanted to be able to give recognition for all student achievement. So you'll notice in this rubric that there are marks given all across the rows. So typically in rubrics, you just click one, and so the student may have done a little bit in the A column, might have done some in the D column, but they don't know that. We sort of give them an average. So what we wanted to do was give them recognition for everything that they had done, so that the next time they did it, they would continue doing it. We also wanted to support inter-rater reliability by reducing the need for marker interpretation. So there's quite a bit of detail given within the rubric. And we wanted to enable the marker efficiency by reducing the need for additional instructor feedback. So within the rubric, basically all the feedback is built into it. So another thing that we did was typically students look for the grade. What we wanted to do was move them away from looking at the grade and actually focusing on the consequences of what they did. So given that this is helping them prepare for an interview and articulate their skills, they might have passed, you know, according to the grade with a C, but at the end of the day, they're not going to get that interview. And so what we wanted to do was try and get them to focus on the consequences of what they had achieved, rather than just looking for the number and then moving on. The other thing we did was we gave positive indicators at every level. So within here, there isn't a statement that says did not do this. We always wanted to let them know what they had done. So even though this is in the D level column, you know, they're going to be told that they did name the one professional skill that was used to resolve the situation or the task. They're also going to be, you know, given another mark for naming that one professional behavior. So they always know what it is that they had done. The other thing that we did was we wanted this to be able to act almost as a checklist, not only for the TAs when they were marking, but also for the students when they were preparing it. So we gave them this rubric ahead of time. And basically when students were filling out or completing their reflection, they could use this as, yes, I did name the one skill. Yes, I did talk about when, where, and who it was involved. Yes, I presented each action separately. So again, it was built as a checklist, and it also helped with the inter-rater reliability. To further clarify some of the criteria, we not only stated what it was, but you'll see over here we actually provided an example. So give specific details that show how you went about taking one set of the actions, and then we gave an example of what that looks like. So as a marker, I don't have to clarify, it's the example is in here. And visually, the student can see what they did, so they can see that, oh yes, I did all of that. And the gray areas, they can treat as missed opportunities, so that the next time that they are asked to do this in the course, and they were asked to do it 3 times, they can go back and go, oh, I forgot to describe the actions that were taken. So I'm going to make sure that I do that the next time. The other thing we did too was indicate the relative importance by looking at the grades. So if they wanted to improve, this mark of 40 is where you should be spending most of your time looking, rather than looking at this criteria, which talks about the description of the task. It's only worth 11. The result only worth 9%. So in this particular area, I really wanted them to know that being able to describe those actions was sort of the focus. Another area that we often get stuck on or caught up on is editing and proofreading and grammar. And yes, we do want them to do that, but I only have so much time in my course to give feedback. And so that's not the focus of it. And I would only comment on it if the grammar or the spelling was so bad that it detracted from the message the student was trying to give. And again, it was only worth 5%. So these are just a few, strategies that we incorporated into this rubric. It could be made into a checklist or a bank of feedback statements that you could use. But again, it was just helping the student sort of get feedback on their own and also incorporate that inter-rater reliability and decrease the amount of qualitative feedback I as an instructor would have to give. I'm going to pass it over to you, Victoria, again to carry on.
Thanks, Catherine. Jennifer has a question about that rubric. What software was used to create it?
Jennifer, we hired somebody to develop it. As I said, it was a custom built rubric, and it's very specific for the STAR format assignment that we had created.
Sorry, I'm just getting the slideshow back up here, and Teams is always changing.
Yes.
And I'm just going to wait a couple seconds because I see Trish and Jennifer are typing in. I'm guessing those are questions about WhatCV. So
I'm just going to pull this over here so I can see the questions better. And feel free to shout out a question if it's faster. Would this be a student-facing rubric pre-submission? Yes, we shared this at the very beginning, so it could be used in a number of ways. We could use it so the student can assess themselves, but they definitely had access to this at the beginning. It could be used for peer review. We had them do a peer review exercise, and that this rubric was the guidance that had been given to it. That's,
yes.
For Trish.
Just reading Jennifer's comment that being able to select a different part of each column. Yeah, that's a really nice feature of the WhatCV, and it's not something that I've seen anywhere yet in terms of like a Learn rubric or even a PebblePad rubric. It's definitely the kind where you're annotating something in Word or in PDF and then uploading it and doing all the calculations yourself. So it's unfortunate some of these LMSs haven't caught up yet, but hopefully that's not far away.
Yeah, one of the reasons we really liked that, Jennifer, is that instead of giving students the average, we could say, you know, this is a really unique piece that you've contributed, but you'll see that you have lots of gaps that you have to fill in, but, you know, we are recognizing, you know, the stellar thing that they did and want them to keep doing it.
All right, so we'll move on then. I'm getting some overlap. I don't know if the lag is on my end or Catherine, so please do let me know if things are weird for everybody who's participating, and we'll see if we can fix it up. So right now you should be seeing the slide titled Using a Framework and Corresponding Rubric, and I'm switching that over to how do you determine your own criteria. So what if you've chosen the other route to create some or all of the structure, including the framework and marking scheme yourself? So aside from saying that you're very brave, and that's awesome, we can offer these websites as sources. So these websites offer criteria that you can use to build your own reflective framework and corresponding marking scheme. But just remember to, even when you're using these, return to the planning questions again to ensure that you are staying on track with your learning outcomes and purpose for reflection. And these are included on your handout with the live links. So there are those checking questions or planning questions again, just to remind you what they look like. So we've covered assessment criteria, how you're going to assess, but that's just one part of helping students get better at reflecting. Sometimes the criteria itself can provide enough context for grades and even act as feedback. As Catherine showed with the WhatCV rubric, when students read the language in one of those areas, often that's enough for them to understand what they need to do to make improvements. But often students need to have criteria, and especially numeric grades, put in context for them through additional descriptive feedback. So what does good feedback look like that doesn't take up too much of your time, but also allows students to make actionable changes? All right, so here are some good practices to enhance students' ability to reflect using feedback. So assign 3 reflections throughout the term. Research that Katherine was involved in shows that this is the ideal number. So I think it was Steve who mentioned an idea of looking at something week to week. So I think that could work as long as you're looking at things that are quite specific or small that build up. Just avoiding what we call reflection fatigue. Students can get pretty tired of doing any one type of task too many times throughout the term. Use the same reflective framework in rubric each time so students can observe their learning challenges and gains. So they can then compare their current achievement to their past achievement by comparing marked up rubrics, which is also a reflective process and a great idea, but also something you need to often tell them to do, you know, like go back to your first rubric, compare it to this one you got back, what changed, why do you think that changed? And I think that can also help a little bit with what Marco was looking for in the chat, which was strategies encouraging students to reason logically and objectively on their own, having them be able to step back and compare rubrics and draw conclusions about what that means for them could be one way to get them to practice that type of thinking. And you can use a comment bank or feedback statements for consistency and timely feedback. So save oft-used comments in a Word document. But there are some other time-saving features available. If you are using PebblePad to collect and grade assignments, you can prepare feedback statements as shown on the left. And then when you're grading, you can choose a feedback statement from the drop-down as shown on the right. You can also edit and add feedback statements on the fly. And if you're using a Learn rubric, you can prepare initial feedback for each criterion on your rubric as shown on the left. And when you're grading on the rubric, the initial feedback will appear when you click a criterion as shown on the right, and then you can edit it. So for example, you could backspace a comment you don't want or add a comment for more personalization, etc. And these kinds of shortcuts are great if you have teams of TAs or markers to keep everybody sort of on the same page. But always remembering that there should be a certain level of personalization for each student, just to make them feel, you know, that they are the individuals that they are. So as we've mentioned, assigning numeric grades is still largely the expected destination for any assessment, although attitudes around this are slowly changing. But for now, you need to ask yourself, how do you break down the ideally 3 individual reflections within your assessment framework? So one is a scaffolded approach where each iteration is worth more than the one before. This can be encouraging as students begin with low stakes, receive feedback to implement, and move to higher stakes. You could use an improvement approach where students can get the max grade based on how much improvement you observe, rather than comparing them to a set of standards. This is also encouraging while helping students to focus on feedback rather than grades, since they only see a numeric grade at the end. And often that's going to be the max of the grade. And of course, you can combine either of these approaches with mark low on the first one approach. So this means being strict while also sending the message that taking reflection seriously and using feedback to improve will be rewarded. So I'll turn to Katherine now for the home stretch, and she'll take us from the instructor being the main source of grades and feedback to centering students in the feedback process. Katherine?
Okay. Hey, thanks, Victoria. So let me just get here. So what we're going to look at now is ways that we can incorporate the use of feedback into the design process of our courses. And we're going to look at some peer and self-review and how we might use modeling and exemplars. And again, we're going back to Carlos and Bode, who talked about for the feedback processes to be enhanced, students have to need to both appreciate how feedback can operate effectively and be given opportunities to use that feedback within the curriculum. So we're really trying to make sure that they can see how that feedback is used and how it actually helps them improve. And we want to avoid situations where they're given feedback, but they're never able to show that they understand it and they are not able to do anything with it. So let's look at some scenarios that will illustrate how you might incorporate feedback as part of the process. So let's move to here. So again, we want to make sure that we focus our feedback. So there's so many things that we could comment on to help students improve. Remember that it takes practice, you know, it has to be informed by feedback, but they're not going to become perfect in the 4 months that we have them, particularly if it's the first time that they've been exposed to it. So let's try working with what we have and trying to at least get them to improve it. So one of the things that you might do is give them a scenario where they've had some reflection, you gave them some feedback, and now they're doing that reflection again. And what you want the student to do then is to include a note that they give to you, included in the assignment, indicating what they did the last time and what steps they have taken to address it this time. So we're trying to get them to take ownership of the process. So we don't want the instructor to be saying, oh, here's what they did the last time and have they improved. You're actually putting the onus on the student to use that feedback. Now, if you want them to comment on their reactions to the feedback, depending on what the focus of your reflection is, you might provide a couple of sentence starters or 2 or 3 prompts, and they could be things as simple as, what were they surprised at in the feedback? What were they pleased about? What were they disappointed about? And then they can choose from these prompts and decide to include that in their subsequent reflection. Again, sometimes we feel we have to comment on everything, but I would really encourage you to go back to what is the goal of my reflection and choose the 1 or 2 things that the student could focus on. So for example, as I mentioned when I was working with the STAR reflection, the situation, the task, the action, and the result, you know, I would often get students where they're, you know, trying to put in a really nice header in their portfolio, for example. Well, that's not what I want them to focus on. So I would always try and say, let's focus on the action and get that nailed down. And that will actually improve your reflection immensely. Again, it was just keeping in mind that goal for the reflection activity, and that's how I was using it as a guide to look at the kind of feedback that I would actually give somebody. So there's other things that we can do too, which incorporate, instead of you being the source of the feedback, how can you look at peer and self-review to help the students? So first of all, you're going to have good instructions and guidance to help the peers with their peer review and their self-review. But it also increases the amount of feedback that a student can get without imposing on your time. So you've taken time to give them that instruction and that feedback. You've set up the peer review or the self-review activity, and the students are then getting feedback that will help them improve subsequent reflections, but it hasn't impinged on your time. When you allow students to incorporate a peer review or a self-review, it means that when they finally do submit their next reflection to you, it's going to be of better quality. So you're getting something that they've been able to critique, look at, and then improve, and then they can get some feedback from you. Other things you might do is you may decide to, instead of assessing the reflection, you might look at the feedback that the students have provided to their peers and see the quality of that. Or you might read only the student's response to the peer review statement and the comments that they have made on, here's the feedback that I have and here's how I have tried to act upon that. And one thing that might do is flag misunderstandings that are present that students have regarding criteria, or it could flag areas that maybe you want to address as a whole with everybody. Maybe there's a particular section of the reflection that they're not quite understanding, and so you can address this to the whole class. When we use peer review, again, we're following one of the criteria that Dewey and Rodgers have found to help improve reflection, and that is that good feedback practices and good reflective practices take place in community. And so peers can be a source of feedback, and we can help them by providing the structure that scaffolds that process. So we could even give them the rubric and ask them to, provide feedback to their peers using the rubric, using the same methods or that you would be using. And what this does is it also familiarizes them with the feedback vocabulary and the application that they are going to have to use when they are completing their own. You could have a class activity where students are given exemplars that you have created, and then put them in small groups and ask them to assess it using the rubric. So this again is helping them use that rubric, help them look at the criteria, and then you can have them take it up as a larger group. And again, this promotes some clarity and some understanding of what the criteria means, what your expectations are. Students are also exposed to an A level, a B level, and C level examples, and these are things that they often don't see. They often just see their own work, so they don't know what an A, B, or C level looks like. And they're able to compare and contrast between the levels during this discussion. In groups, you might have a thing where they read aloud to each other. So you might put them in groups of 2 or 3, and they just read their responses to each other. And even as they're reading it to someone else, reading aloud might expose some areas that they can immediately identify as areas for improvement. Their peer, as the peer is listening, might be thinking about their own response and thinking, oh, there's something that I could have done to make mine better, or there's something that I'll have to make sure that I don't do because I'm not understanding what my peer is saying, and I think it's the same thing I did in mine. Or between the two of them, they might have a discussion that says, we don't know what this criteria means, and so we're going to seek help and find out what that means. Another thing that we can do to help focus feedback is through self-review. And again, this is where we're putting the onus on the student. So there's only so much that we can do to help them improve. At some point, they are going to have to have an attitude that values their own personal and intellectual growth. And so what we can do is, again, use that comment bank, that feedback statements to help them self-assess. Students then can determine whether or not they understand the criteria, and when they're working on their own, seek help if necessary. Might be from you, might be from a peer. They could use the rubric as a guide and assess the exemplars that you have given on their own. You might use the exemplars as models, and perhaps you've done markup along the sides of it just to say why certain pieces of the reflective response are very effective or not effective. And they can use this to help inform their own response that they're working on. There's also the feature in Learn where they can record themselves using the Bongo video assignment and then listen to themselves and critique it again. So there's a few ways that they can get the feedback that they need before submitting it back to you. And as we're getting to the end of our presentation, I just want to show you an example of how this feedback cycle has been could be incorporated into your course design. So this is a scaffold writing process with reflection and peer review by Dr. Daniel Bratton. So in this case, the students have to do some pre-writing, they have to do a draft, and then they have to submit it to a peer for critique. So in preparation for that, the instructor could have chosen the framework and provided it to the students. The instructor may have provided feedback statements and rubrics to help guide the students in that feedback or that peer process so that they understand the expectations and the criteria. Then the students can critique each other's using maybe the feedback or the rubrics. And when they pass it back to their peer, they can even take more ownership by actually soliciting advice from the peer. So they might have passed the draft over and said something like, can you let me know if this particular piece is effective? On my last bit of feedback, you know, I said I had to improve it. I'd want to see if I'm actually doing it. So when the instructor, after the student gets the peer critique and their peer reviews back, they incorporate that. What they have to do is pass this into their instructor now with a letter to the editor where the students explain what feedback they had received and the revisions that they made, and also why they chose to include that feedback suggestion or not. So again, they're starting to take some ownership and being able to critique what's necessary or helpful for them. Then they are going to go through this cycle again. So they're having, again, another opportunity to get lots of feedback along the way. And then finally, what they're going to be looking at for their third reflection is this portfolio. And they're going to go back over the pieces that they had submitted, the feedback that they had received, and they're going to do a reflection on that. And that reflection might be something like the feedback that I felt helpful, areas that I can see where I've improved on, areas that I'm finding challenging. And again, it's being able to see how receiving that feedback has actually improved their work. So with that in mind, again, we're just trying to promote students to be a bit more intentional in using that feedback, and then as instructors, giving them the opportunity to actually do that. And I'm going to pass it over now to Victoria to see if we've actually accomplished what we had set out to accomplish.
Thanks, Katherine. So at the beginning of this webinar, we presented you with some objectives we had for this time. And what we'd like to do now, since we have set aside the next 25 minutes for chatting, to get us started is we'd like you to choose one of the objectives that is up there and let us know how we met it. So that maybe we didn't meet any of them for you, and we're open to all that kind of feedback. So if that's the case, then let us know if something was missed. But this is also an activity that's quite reflective in nature that you can do with your own students. It could be after a unit, it could be throughout the course, having them look at the learning outcomes that you've set out and say, okay, this is what I did, this is how I know that I have met this objective, or I'm even just on my way to meeting it. So you're welcome at this point to unmute, share your camera, however you feel you best participate, drop it in the chat. And I know we threw a lot at you over the last hour, so just we'll give you maybe a couple of minutes to think about how we might have met one of those objectives, or something that you want to shake your fist at us for not meeting.
The moment of truth. Jennifer.
Sorry, my mic is really, really bad. I'm sorry. Just the idea of, like, I've done peer review where the students have like given comments to their classmates, and I think they really enjoy it. Like their comments are great. but I never thought of like the follow-up after that to get the people who received the comments to reflect back on what they learned from it. I just left it to them to sort of do that on their own. Like I left it up to them, like if you want to choose or follow the advice of your peer, that's your choice. But the idea of asking them to reflect further on that ability to learn from their classmates is something I never considered before. So.
Great.
Yes,
Thanks for sharing
awesome.
that, Jennifer.
Yeah, it really is about surfacing that learning in intentional ways, which we are used to assuming it's just happening, but getting students to actually articulate why, if they made decisions based on it, why or why not, is where a lot of that actual remembering will start to happen for them. And Cheryl mentioned that she liked the prompts that we provided. Yes, that's awesome. So that could fit in like to strategies that you could try yourself, and even using the prompts as a starting place to sort of write some of your own that might be more specific. But I think we can tend to think of things like prompts and sentence starters as very like juvenile, high school, but especially when it comes to reflection, this is an area that students just don't have a lot of exposure to. And these things, especially first year, second year, can really help them get started thinking about these things and using specific language to talk about their skills.
I think too, it surfaces, lets them surface that emotional aspect that's associated with learning as well, which we often don't talk about, you know, explicitly, but it's definitely there.
So feel free to comment on any of our any of our objectives, or if you have any questions at this point, please let us know. We have time.